Salamat siang to you too. Is Steven there? I see two people. Maybe Steven is there. Alright. And Louis is here. Thanks for your patience. I was trying to time everything so to be done by 10 because I figured that's when you guys would be ready. Okay. Louis. Okay, so we just learned like what exactly music, like what we learned a lot about cultural differences between Cloth's culture and the Adem and what they think about music and how music is like a super intimate, private thing. That's where we left off. We are on chapter 114, His Sharp and Single Arrow. Reluctantly, I took Vachette's advice, and though my fingers itched for it, I did not bring out my lute that night and fill my small corner of the school with music. I even went so far as to slide my lute case underneath my bed, lest the mere sight of it fill the school with rumor. For several days I did little but study under Vachette. I ate alone and made no attempt to speak with anyone, as I was suddenly self-conscious of my language. Carceret kept her distance, but she was always there, watching me, her eyes flat and angry as a snake's. You're making this difficult, Louis. Pressing your entire face against this book while I'm trying to hold it. I took advantage of Vachette's excellent Aturan and asked 1,000 questions that would have been too subtle for Tempe to understand. I waited 3 entire days until I asked her the question that had been slowly smoldering inside me since I'd climbed the foothill of the storm wall. Personally, I thought this showed exceptional restraint. And there go the fireworks. Vachette, I asked, do your people have stories of the Chandrian? Why are you being aggressive with your cuddling? Can you just like chill on my lap? Can you just like relax? She looked at me, her normally expressive face gone suddenly impassive. And what does this have to do with your hand talk? Her hand flickered through several different variations of the gesture that indicated disapproval and reproach. What? What do you want? Can I help you? You're interrupting. Nothing, I said. Does it have something to do with your fighting, then? She asked. No scratching the carpet! Sorry, the cats are out of control tonight. Out of control. No, I admitted, but surely it relates to the Catan, Vachette said, or to the Lethani, or perhaps it touches on some subtle shade of meaning you have difficulty grasping in Ademic. You can hear him purring. He is a really loud purrer. I am merely curious. Vachette sighed. Can I persuade you to focus your curiosity on more pressing matters? She asked, gesturing exasperated, firm rebuke. I quickly let the matter drop. Not only was Vachette my teacher, she was my only companion. The last thing I wanted to do was irritate her or give the impression that I was less than attentive to her lessons. Thank you for calming down. That's good. But you just stay right there. With that one disappointing exception, Vachette was a sparkling font of information. She answered my endless questions quickly and clearly. As a result, I couldn't help but feel that my skill in speaking and fighting was progressing in great leaps and bounds. Vachette did not share my enthusiasm, and was not bashful about saying so, eloquently, in 2 languages. Vachette and I were down in the hidden valley that contained the sword tree. I just think of Ranch every time he says that. We had been practicing our hand fighting for about an hour, and were now sitting in the long grass, catching our breath. Rather, I was catching my breath. Vachette was not winded at all. Fighting me was nothing to her, and there was no time when she couldn't chide me for sloppiness by reaching lazily past my defenses to cuff me on the side of the head. Vachette, I said, mustering the courage to ask a question that had been bothering me for some time. May I ask a question that is perhaps presumptuous? I prefer a presumptuous student, she said. I had hoped we were beyond the point of worrying about such things. What is the purpose of all this? I gestured between the two of us. The purpose of this, she mimicked my gesture, is to teach you enough so that you no longer fight like a little boy, drunk on his mother's wine. Today her sandy hair was tied in 2 short braids that hung down her back on either side of her neck. This made her look oddly girlish, and had not done wonders for my self-esteem over the last hour, as she had repeatedly thrown me to the ground forced me into submission, and struck me with countless solid but generously pulled punches and kicks. And once, laughing, she had stepped easily behind me and slapped me firmly on the ass, as if she were a lecherous tap-room drunk and I some low-bodiced serving-girl. "But why?" I asked. "To what purpose are you teaching me? If Tempe was wrong to teach me, why continue to teach me more?" Bichette nodded approvingly. "I've been wondering how long it would take you to ask that," she said. "It should have been one of your first questions." "I've been told I ask too many questions," I said. "I've been trying to step a little more carefully here." Bichette sat forward, suddenly businesslike. "You know things you should not. Shane does not mind that you know of the Lethani, though others feel differently. But there is agreement on the subject of our Catan. It is not for barbarians. It is only for the Adem, and only for those who follow the path of the sword tree." Bichette continued. "Shane's thought is thus. If you were part of the school, you would be part of Ademra. If you are part of Ademra, you are no longer a barbarian. And if you are no longer a barbarian, it would not be wrong for you to know these things." It had a certain convoluted logic to it. "That also means Tempe would not be wrong for teaching me." She nodded. "Exactly. Instead of bringing home an unwanted puppy, it would be as if he had returned a lost lamb to the fold." "Must I be a lamb or a puppy?" I sighed. "It's undignified." "You fight as a puppy fights," she said, "eager and clumsy." "But aren't I already part of the school?" I asked. "You are teaching me, after all." Bichette shook her head. "You sleep in the school and eat our food, but that does not make you a student. Many children study the Catan with hopes of entering the school and some day wearing the red. They live and study with us. They are in the school, but not of the school, if you follow me." "It seems odd to me that so many want to become mercenaries," I said as gently as possible. "You seem eager enough," she said with an edge to her voice. "I am eager to learn," I said, "not take the life of a mercenary. I mean no offense." Bichette stretched her neck, working out some stiffness. "It is your language getting in the way. In the barbarian lands, mercenaries are the lowest rung of society. No matter how thick or useless a man might be, he can carry a cudgel and earn a halfpenny a day guarding a caravan. Am I right?" "The lifestyle does not tend to attract a rough sort of person," I said. "We are not mercenaries of that kind. We are paid, but we choose which jobs we like." She paused. "If you fight for your purse, you are a mercenary. What are you called if you fight out of duty for your country?" "A soldier." "If you fight for the law?" "A constable or a bailiff." "If you fight for your reputation?" I had to think a bit on that one. "A duelist, perhaps?" "If you fight for the good of others?" "An emir," I said without thinking. She cocked her head at me. "That is an interesting choice," she said. Bichette held up her arm, displaying the red sleeve proudly. "We Adem are paid to guard, to hunt, to protect. We fight for our land and our school and our reputations. And we fight for the Lethani. With the Lethani. In the Lethani. All these things together. The Adem word for one who takes the red is Cathan." She looked up at me. "And it is a very proud thing." "So becoming a mercenary is quite high on the Adem social ladder," I said. She nodded. "But barbarians do not know this word and wouldn't understand even if they did. So mercenary must suffice." Bichette pulled 2 long strands of grass from the ground and began to twist them together into a cord. "This is why Shane's decision is not an easy one to make. She must balance what is right against what is best for her school, all the while taking into consideration the good of the entire path of the sword tree. Rather than make a rash decision, she is playing a more patient game. Personally, I think she's hoping the problem will take care of itself." "How would this take care of itself?" I asked. "You could have run off," she said simply. "Many assumed you would. If I'd decided you were not worth teaching, that would have taken it out of her hands as well. Or you could die during your training, or become crippled." I stared at her. She shrugged. "Accidents happen. Not often, but sometimes. If Carceret had been your teacher—" I grimaced. "So how does one officially become a member of the school? Is there some sort of test?" She shook her head. "First, someone must stand on your behalf, saying you are worthy of joining the school." "Tempe?" I asked. "Someone of consequence," she clarified. "So that would be you," I said slowly. Bichette grinned, tapping the side of her crimped nose, then pointing at me. "Only took you 2 guesses. If you ever progress to the point I feel you won't embarrass me, I'll stand on your behalf and you can take the test." She continued to twist the blades of grass together, her hands moving in a steady, complicated pattern. I'd never seen another Adem idly toy with something like this while talking. They couldn't, of course. They needed one hand free to talk. "If you pass this test, you are no longer a barbarian. Tempe is vindicated, and everyone goes home happy, except for those who aren't, of course. And if I don't pass this test? I asked. Or what if you decide I'm not good enough to take it? Then things grow complicated. She came to her feet. Come, Shane has asked to speak with you today. It would not be polite of us to be late. Bichette led the way back to the small cluster of low stone buildings. When I'd first seen them, I'd assumed they were the town buildings. Oops, I skipped a line. When I'd first seen them, I'd assumed they were the town itself. Now I knew they composed the school. The group of buildings was like a tiny university, except there was none of the scheduled regimen I was used to. There was no formal ranking system, either. Those with their reds were treated with deference, and Shane was obviously in charge. Other than that, all I had was a vague impression of a social pecking order. Tempe was obviously rather low and not well thought of. Bichette was rather high and respected. When we arrived for our meeting, Shane was midway through performing the Catan. I watched silently as she moved at the speed of honey spreading on a tabletop. The Catan grows more difficult the slower it is done, but she performed it flawlessly. It took her half an hour to finish, after which she opened a window. A curl of wind brought in the sweet smell of summer grass and the sound of leaves. Shane sat. She wasn't breathing hard, though a sheen of sweat covered her skin. "Did Tempe tell you of the 99 tales?" she asked without preamble. "Of Aeth and the beginning of the Adem?" I shook my head. "Good," Shane said. "It is not his place to do such a thing, and he could not do it properly." She looked at Bichette. "How is language coming?" "Quickly, as these things go," she said. "However." "Very well," Shane said, switching to precise, slightly accented Oturan. "I will tell it like this, so there will be less interruption and less room for misunderstanding." I did my best to gesture respectful gratitude. "This is a story of years ago," Shane said formally, "before this school, before the path of the sword tree, before any Adem knew of the Lethani. This is a story of the beginning of such things. The first Adem school was not a school that taught sword work. Surprisingly, it was founded by a man named Aeth, who sought mastery over the arrow and the bow." Shane paused in her tale and gave a word of explanation. "You should know that in those days use of the bow was very common. The skill of it was much prized. We were shepherds, and much set on by our enemies, and the bow was the best tool we had to defend ourselves." Shane leaned back in her chair and continued. "Aeth did not set out to found a school. There were no schools in those days. He merely sought to improve his skill. All his will he bent upon this, until he could shoot an apple from a tree 100 feet away. Then he strove until he could shoot the wick of a burning candle. Soon the only target that challenged him was a piece of hanging silk blowing in the wind. Aeth strove until he could anticipate the turning of the wind, and once he had mastered this thing, he could not miss. Stories of his talent spread, and others came to him. Among them was a young woman named Reth. At first Aeth doubted she possessed the strength to draw the bow, but she was soon regarded as his finest student. As I have said, this was long years and distant miles from where we sit. In those days the Adem did not have the Lethani to guide us, and so it was a rough and bloody time. In those days it was not uncommon for one Adem to kill another out of pride, or form an argument, or as proof of skill. Since Aeth was the greatest of archers, many challenged him, but a body is nothing of a target when one can strike silk blowing in the wind. Aeth slew him easily as cutting wheat. He took only a single arrow with him to a duel, and claimed if that single arrow was not enough, he deserved to be struck down. Aeth grew older, and his fame spread. He put down roots and began the first of the Adem schools. Years passed, and he trained many Adem to be deadly as knives. It became well known that if you gave Aeth's students 3 arrows and 3 coins, your 3 worst enemies would never bother you again. So the school grew rich and famous and proud, and so did Aeth. It was then that Reth came to him. Reth, his best student. Reth, who stood nearest his ear and closest to his heart. Reth spoke to Aeth, and they disagreed. Then they argued. Then they shouted loud enough that all the school could hear it through the thick stone walls. And at the end of it, Reth challenged Aeth to a duel. Aeth accepted, and it was known that the winner would control the school from that day forth. As she challenged, Aeth chose his place first. He chose to stand among a grove of young and swaying trees that gave him shifting cover. Normally he would not bother with precautions such as this, but Reth was his finest student, and she could read the wind just as well as he. He took with him his bow of horn. He took with him his sharp and single arrow. Then Reth chose her place to stand. She walked to the top of a high hill, her outline clear against the naked sky. She carried neither bow nor arrow. and when she reached the top of the hill, she sat calmly on the ground. This was perhaps the oddest thing of all, as Aeth was known to sometimes strike a foe through the leg rather than kill them. Aeth saw his student do this, and he was filled with anger. Aeth took his single arrow and fitted it to his bow. Aeth drew the string against his ear. The string Reth had made for him, woven from the long, strong strands of her own hair. Shane met my eye. Full of anger, Aeth shot his arrow. It struck Reth like a thunderbolt. Here. She pointed with 2 fingers at the inner curve of her left breast. Still seated, arrow sprouting from her chest, Reth drew a long ribbon of white silk from beneath her shirt. She took a white feather from the arrow's fletching, dipped it in her blood, and wrote 4 lines of poetry. Then Reth held the ribbon aloft for a long moment, waiting as the wind pulled first one way, then another. Then Reth loosed it, the silk twisting through the air, rising and falling on the breeze. The ribbon twisted in the wind, wove its way through the trees, and pressed itself firmly against Aeth's chest. It read, Aeth, near my heart, without vanity the ribbon, without duty the wind, without blood the victory. I heard a low noise and looked over to see Vachette weeping quietly to herself. Her head was lowered, and tears ran down her face to drip deeper spots of red onto the front of her shirt. Shane continued. Only after Aeth read these lines did he recognize the deep wisdom his student possessed. He hurried to tend Reth's wounds, but the head of the arrow was lodged too close to her heart to be removed. Reth lived only 3 days after that, with the grief-stricken Aeth tending her. He gave her control of the school, and listened to her words, all the while the head of the arrow riding close to her heart. During those days, Reth dictated 99 stories, and Aeth wrote them down. These tales were the beginning of our understanding of the Lithani. They are the root of all Ademra. Late in the 3rd day, Reth finished telling the 99th story to Aeth, who now held himself to be his student's student. After Aeth finished writing, Reth said to him, There is one final story, more important than all the rest, and that one shall be known when I awake. Then Reth closed her eyes and slept, and sleeping, she died. Aeth lived 40 years after that, and it is said he never killed again. In the years that followed, he was often heard to say, I won the only duel I ever lost. He continued to run the school and train his students to be masters of the bow, but now he also trained them to be wise. He told them the 99 tales, and thus it was the Lithani first came to be known by all Ademra, and that is how we came to be that which we are. There was a long pause. I thank you, Shane, I said, doing my best to gesture respectful gratitude. I would very much like to hear these 9 and 90 stories. They are not for barbarians, she said, but she didn't seem offended at my request, gesturing a combination of reproach and regret. She changed the subject. How is your Catan coming? I struggle to improve, Shane. She turned to Vachette. Does he? There is certainly struggle, Vachette said, her eyes still red with tears. Wry amusement. But there is improvement, too. Shane nodded, reserved approval. Several of us will be fighting tomorrow. Perhaps you could bring him to watch. Vachette made an elegant motion that made me appreciate how little I knew of the subtleties of hand language. Gracious, thankful, slightly submissive acceptance. Yeah, that story was probably pretty cool. There's so many stories within stories in this. I'm just gonna do a thing real quick to hopefully like muffle this fan sound. I don't know. I have my laptop right here, and the fan gets really loud, so these cats are, I don't know if you can hear my cats, but they're very slowly fighting each other. Bullying. That's a good question, Eric. Anyway, You should be flattered, Vachette said cheerfully. A conversation with Shane and an invitation to watch her fight. We were making our way back to a sheltered box valley where we typically practiced the Catan and our hand fighting. However, my mind kept spinning back to several unavoidable and unpleasant thoughts. I was thinking about secrets and how people longed to keep them. I wondered what Kilvin would do if I brought someone into the fishery and showed them the sigildry for blood and bone and hair. I thought of the big artificer's anger. The thought of the big artificer's anger was enough to make me shiver. I knew the sort of trouble I would face. That was clearly laid out in the university's laws. But what would he do to the person I had taught these things to? Vichette slapped my chest with the back of her hand to get my attention. I said you should be flattered, she repeated. I am, I said. Oh, okay, that's good that you can't hear the fan, okay. I can't tell how loud it sounds to you, so that's good. She took hold of my shoulder, turning me to face her. You've gone all pensive on me. What will be done with Tempe if all of this ends badly? I asked bluntly. Her cheerful expression faded. His reds will be taken away, and his sword, and his name, and he will be cut away from the Latanta. She drew a slow breath. It is unlikely any other school would take him after such a thing, so this would effectively exile him from all Edemra. But exile won't work for me, I said. Forcing me back into the world would only make the problem worse, wouldn't it? Vichette didn't say anything. When all of this started, I said, you encouraged me to leave. If I had run, would I have been allowed to go? There was a long silence that told me the truth of it, but she said it aloud, too. No. I appreciated not being lied to about it. And what is my punishment to be? I asked. Imprisonment? I shook my head. No, it's not practical to keep me locked up here for years. I looked up at her. So what? Punishment is not our concern, she said. You are a barbarian, after all. You did not know you were doing anything wrong. The main concern is to prevent you from teaching others what you have stolen, to keep you from using it to your own profit. She hadn't answered my question. I gave her a long look. Some say killing you would be the best way, she said frankly, but most believe killing is not in keeping with the Lithani. Shane is among these, as am I. I relaxed slightly. That was something at least. And I don't suppose a promise on my part would reassure anyone. She gave me a sympathetic smile. It speaks well of you that you came back with Tempe, and you stayed when I tried to drive you away, but the promise of a barbarian amounts for little in this. What then? I asked, suspecting the answer and knowing I wasn't going to like it. She took a deep breath. You could be prevented from teaching by removing your tongue or putting out your eyes, she said frankly. To keep you from using the katan, you might be hobbled, your ankle tendon cut, or the knee of your favored leg lamed. She shrugged. But one can still be a good fighter even with a damaged leg, so it would be more effective to remove the two smallest fingers from your right hand. This would be... Vichette kept speaking in her matter-of-fact tone. I think she intended it to be reassuring, calming, but it had the opposite effect. All I could think of was her cutting off my fingers as calmly as you would pare away a piece of apple. Everything grew bright around the edges of my vision, and the vivid mental picture made my stomach roll over. I thought for a moment I might be sick. The lightheadedness and nausea passed. As I came to my senses, I realized Vichette had finished talking and was staring at me. Before I could say anything, she waved a hand dismissively. I see I will get no more use of you today. Take the rest of the evening for yourself. Get your thoughts in order or practice the katan. Go watch the sword tree. Tomorrow we will continue. Don't do that. I walked aimlessly for a while, trying not to think about my fingers being cut away. Then, coming over a hill, I stumbled almost literally onto a naked Adem couple tucked away in a grove of trees. They didn't scramble for their clothes when I burst out of the trees, and rather than try to apologize with my poor language and fuddled wits, I simply turned and left, face burning with embarrassment. I tried to practice the katan, but couldn't keep my mind on it. I went to watch the sword tree, and for a while the sight of it moving gracefully in the wind calmed me. Then my mind drifted, and I was confronted with the image of Vichette paring off my fingers again. I heard the 3 high bells and went to dinner. I was standing in line, half stupid with the mental effort of not thinking of someone maiming my hands, when I noticed the Adem standing nearby was staring at me. A young girl of about 10 wore an expression of open amazement on her face, and a man in his mercenary reds looked at me as if he had just seen me wipe my ass with a piece of bread and eat it. Only then did I realize I was humming. Not loud, exactly, but loud enough for those nearby to hear. I couldn't have been doing it for long, as I was only 6 lines in to leave the town tinker. Oh my god, you're adorable. You're so cute. Louis being cute, but he's not on camera, so you can't see it. I stopped, then lowered my eyes, took my food, and spent 10 minutes trying to eat. I managed a few bites, but that was all. Eventually I gave up and headed to my room. I lay in bed, running through the options in my mind. How far could I run? Could I lose myself in the surrounding countryside? Could I steal a horse? Had I even seen a horse since I'd been in Hert? I brought out my lute and practiced my chording a bit, all 5 of my clever fingers flicking up and down the long neck of the lute. But my right hand ached to strum and pick notes from the strings. It was as frustrating as trying to kiss someone using only one lip, and I soon gave up. At last I brought out my shade and wrapped it around myself. It was warm and comforting. I drew the hood over my head as far as it would go and thought of the dark piece of Thay where Felurian had gathered its shadows. I thought of the university, of Will and Sim, of Ari and Devi and Fela. I had never been popular at the university, and my circle of friends had never seemed particularly large, but the truth was I'd simply forgotten what it was like to be truly alone. I thought of my family then. I thought of the Chandrian, of Cinder, his fluid grace, his sword held easily in his hand like a piece of winter ice. I thought of killing him. I thought of Denna and what the Cathay had told me. I thought of her patron and the things I had said during our fight. I thought about the time she had slipped on the road and I had caught her, how the gentle curve above her hip had felt against my hand. I thought about the shape of her mouth, the sound of her voice, the smell of her hair. And eventually I stepped softly through the doors of sleep. Yeah, sorry. He's resting. He's chilling here. He's got the front of his body on my lap, and then his head's just leaning against me. And he's purring. He's being so cute. Okay. Chapter 115. Storm and Stone. I woke the next morning knowing the truth. My only way out of this situation was through the school. I needed to prove myself. That meant I needed everything Vachette could teach me as quickly as possible. So the next morning I rose in the pale blue light of dawn, and when Vachette emerged from her small stone house, I was waiting for her. I was not particularly bright-eyed or bushy-tailed, as my sleep had been filled with troubling dreams, but I was ready to learn. I realize now that I may have given an inaccurate impression of Hert. It was no thriving metropolis, obviously, and it couldn't be considered a city by any stretch of the imagination. In some ways it was barely a town. I do not say this disparagingly. I spent the majority of my young life traveling with my troop, moving from small town to small town. Half the world is made of tiny communities that have grown up around nothing more than a crossroads market, or a good clay pit, or a bend of river strong enough to turn a mill wheel. Sometimes these towns are prosperous. Some have rich soil and generous weather. Some thrive on the trade moving through them. The wealth of these places is obvious. The houses are large and well-mended. People are friendly and generous. The children are fat and happy. There are luxuries for sale, pepper and cinnamon and chocolate. There is coffee and good wine and music at the local inn. Then there are the other sort of towns. Towns where the soil is thin and tired. Towns where the mill burned down or the clay was mined out years ago. In these places the houses are small and badly patched. The people are lean and suspicious, and wealth is measured in small practical ways. Cords of firewood, a second pig, 5 jars of blackberry preserve. At first glance, Hert seemed to be this sort of town. It was little more than tiny homes, broken stone, and the occasional penned goat. In most parts of the Commonwealth, or anywhere in the Four Corners for that matter, a family living in a small cottage with only a few sticks of furniture would be viewed as unfortunate, one step away from paupers. "Baloo, what's wrong?" But while most of the Adem homes I had seen were relatively small, they weren't the same sort you would find in a desperate Arturian town, made of sod and logs chinked with mud. The Adem homes were all snug stone, fit together as cunningly as anything I had ever seen. There were no cracks letting in the endless wind, no leaking roofs, no creaking leather hinges on the doors. The windows weren't oiled sheepskin or empty holes with wooden shutters. They were fitted glass, tight as any you would find in a banker's manor. I never saw a fireplace in all my time in Hert. Don't get me wrong, fireplaces are better than freezing to death by a long step, but most of the rough ones folk can build for themselves out of loose fieldstone or cinder block are drafty, dirty, and inefficient. They fill your house with soot and your lungs with smoke. Instead of fireplaces, each Adem home had its own iron stove, the sort of stove that weighs hundreds of pounds, the sort of stove made of thick drop iron so you can stoke it until it glows with heat, the sort of stove that lasts a century and costs more than a farmer earns from an entire year of hard harvesting. Some of these stoves were small, good for heating and cooking, but I saw more than a few that were larger and could be used for baking, too. One of these treasures was tucked away in a low stone house of only 3 rooms. The rugs on the Adem floors were mostly simple, but they were of thick, soft wool, deeply dyed. The floors beneath those rugs were smooth, sanded wood, not dirt. There were no guttering tallow tapers or reed lights. There were beeswax candles, or lamps that burned a clean white oil, and once, through a distant window, I recognized the unwavering red light of a sympathy lamp. It was this last that made me realize the truth. This was not a scattered handful of desperate folk, scratching out a lean existence on the bare mountainside. They were not living hand to mouth, eating cabbage soup and living in fear of winter. This community was comfortably, quietly prosperous. More than that, despite the lack of glittering banquet halls and fancy gowns, despite the absence of servants and statuary, each of these homes was like a tiny manor house. They were each of them wealthy in a quiet, practical way. "What did you think?" Bichette said, laughing at me. "That a handful of us win our reds and run off to lives of mad luxury while our families drink their own bathwater and die of scurvy?" "I hadn't thought of it at all, really," I said, looking around. Bichette was beginning to show me how to use a sword. We had been at it for 2 hours, and she had done little more than explain the different ways of holding it, as if it were a baby and not a piece of steel. Now that I knew what to look for, I could see dozens of the Adem houses worked cunningly into the landscape. Heavy wooden doors were dug into bluffs. Others looked like little more than tumbles of stone. Some had grass growing on their roofs and could only be recognized by the stovepipes peeping out. A fat nanny goat grazed atop one of these, her udder swinging as she stretched out her neck to crop a mouthful of grass. "Look at the land around you," she said, spinning in a slow circle to take in the landscape. "The ground is too thin for the plow, too jagged for horses. The summer too wet for wheat, too harsh for fruit. Some mountains hold iron or coal or gold, but not these mountains. In winter the snow will pile higher than your head. In spring the storms will push you from your feet." She looked back at me. "This is our land because no one else wants it," she shrugged. "Or rather, it became ours for that reason." Bichette adjusted her sword on her shoulder, then eyed me speculatively. "Sit and listen," she said formally, "and I will tell you a story of time long gone. Another story is coming." I sat on the grass, and Bichette took her place on a nearby stone. "Long ago," she said, "the Adem were upheaved from our rightful place. Something we cannot remember drove us out. Someone stole our land, or ruined it, or made us flee in fear. We were forced to wander endlessly, our whole nation mendicant, like beggars. We would find a place and settle and rest our flocks. Then those who lived nearby would drive us off. The Adem were fierce back then. If we had not been fierce, there would be none of us left today. But we were few, so we were always driven forth. Finally, we found this thin and windy place, unwanted by the world. We dug our roots deep into the stone and made it ours." Bichette's eyes wandered the landscape. "But this land had little to give us, a place for our flocks to graze, stone, and endless wind. We could not find a way to sell the wind, so we sold our fierceness to the world. So we lived, and slowly we sharpened ourselves into the thing we are today. No longer only fierce, but dangerous and proud, unceasing as the wind and strong as stone." I waited a moment to make sure she was finished. "My people are wanderers too," I said. "It is our way. Nowhere and everywhere is where we live." She shrugged, smiling. "It is a story, mind you, and an old one. Take from it what you will." "I am fond of stories," I said. "A story is like a nut," Bichette said. "A fool will swallow it whole and choke. A fool will throw it away, thinking it of little worth. She smiled. "But a wise woman finds a way to crack the shell and eat the meat inside." I got to my feet and walked to where she was sitting. I kissed her hands and her forehead and her mouth. "Bichette," I said, "I am glad Shane gave me to you." "You are a foolish boy." She looked down, but I could see a faint blush rising on her face as she spoke. "Come, we should go. You do not want to miss the chance to see Shane fight." Bichette led me to an unmarked piece of meadow where the thick grass had been grazed close to the ground. A few other Adem already stood nearby, waiting. Some folk had brought small stools or rolled pieces of log to use as benches. Bichette simply sat on the ground. I joined her. A crowd slowly gathered. Only 30 people or so, but it was the most Adem I'd ever seen together other than the dining hall. They gathered in twos and threes, moving from one conversation to another. Rarely did a group of 5 coalesce for any length of time. Though there were a dozen conversations all within a stone's throw of me, I couldn't hear more than a murmur. The speakers stood close enough to touch, and the wind in the grass made more noise than their voices. But I could tell the tone of each conversation from where I sat. 2 months ago this gathering would have seemed eerily subdued, a gathering of fidgety, emotionless, near mutes. But now I could plainly see one pair of Adem were teacher and student by how far apart they stood, by the deference in the younger woman's hands. The cluster of 3 red-shirted men were friends, easy and joking as they jostled at each other. That man and woman were fighting. She was angry. He was trying to explain. I suddenly wondered how I ever could have thought of these people as restless or fidgety. Every motion was to a purpose. Every shifting of the feet implied a change in attitude. Every gesture spoke volumes. Bichette and I sat close to each other and kept our voices low, continuing our discussion in Oturan. She explained how each school had standing accounts with the Sealdish moneylenders. That meant far-flung mercenaries could deposit the school's share of their earnings anywhere people used Sealdish currency, which meant anywhere in the entire civilized world. That money was then tallied to the appropriate account so the school could make use of it. "How much does a mercenary send back to the school?" I asked, curious. 80%, she said. 80%? I asked, holding up all my fingers but two. Sure, I had misheard. 80, Bichette said firmly. That is the proper amount, though many pride themselves on giving more. The same would be true for you, she said dismissively, if you stood a fiddler's chance in hell of ever wearing the red. Seeing my astonishment, she explained. It is not much when you think of it. It is not so much when you think of it. For years, the school feeds and clothes you. It gives you a place to sleep. It gives you your sword, your training. After this investment, the mercenary supports the school. The school supports the village. The village produces children who hope to someday take the red. She made a circle with her finger. Thus all Ademra thrives. Bichette gave me a grave look. Knowing this, perhaps you can begin to understand what you have stolen, she said. Not just a secret, but the major export of the Adem. You have stolen the key to this entire town's survival. It was a sobering thought. Suddenly Carceret's anger made much better sense. I caught a glimpse of Shane's white shirt and roughly knitted yellow cap through the crowd. The scattered conversations grew still, and everyone began to gather into a large loose circle. It wasn't just Shane fighting today, apparently. The first to fight were the two boys a few years younger than myself, neither of them wearing red. They circled each other warily, then fell on each other in a flurry of blows. It was too fast for my eye to follow, and I saw a dozen half-formed pieces of the katana scattered and discarded. It finally ended when one boy caught the other's wrist and shoulder in Sleeping Bear. It was only when I saw the boy twist his opponent's arm and force him to the ground that I recognized it as the grip Tempe had used in the bar fight in Crosson. The boys separated, and two red-shirted mercenaries came out to talk to them, presumably their teachers. Bichette leaned her head close to mine. "What do you think?" "They're very quick," I said. She looked at me. "But—" "They seem rather sloppy," I said, being careful to speak quietly. "Not at first, but after they started." I pointed at one. His feet were too close together, and the other kept leaning forward so his balance was off. That's how he got caught in Sleeping Bear. Bichette nodded, pleased. "They fight like puppies. They are young, and boys. They are full of anger and impatience. Women have less trouble with these things. It's part of what makes us better fighters." I was more than slightly surprised to hear her say that. "Women are better fighters?" I asked carefully, not wanting to contradict her. "Generally speaking," she said matter-of-factly. "There are exceptions, of course, but as a whole, women are better." "But men are stronger," I said. "Taller. They have better reach." She turned to look at me, slightly amused. "Are you stronger and taller than me, then?" I smiled. "Obviously not, but as a whole, you have to admit, men are bigger and stronger." Bichette shrugged. "And that would matter if fighting were the same as splitting wood or hauling hay. That is like saying a sword is better the longer and heavier it is. Foolishness. Perhaps for thugs this is true, but after taking the red, the key is knowing when to fight. Men are full of anger, so they have trouble with this. Women less so." I opened my mouth, then thought of Dadan, and closed it. A shadow fell over us, and I looked up to see a tall man in his reds, standing at a polite distance. He held his hand poised near the hilt of his sword. Invitation. Bichette gestured back, gentle regret and refusal. I watched as he walked away. "Won't they think less of you for not fighting?" Bichette sniffed disdainfully. "He didn't want to fight," she said. "It would only embarrass him and waste my time." "Oh, he didn't want to fight," she said. "It would only embarrass him and waste my time. He merely wanted to show he was brave enough to fight me." She sighed and gave me a pointed look. "It is that sort of foolishness that leads men from the Lothani." The next match was between two red-shirted mercenaries, and the difference was obvious. Everything was much cleaner and crisper. The two boys had been frantic as sparrows flapping in the dust, but the fights that followed were elegant as dances. Many of the bouts were hand-fighting. These lasted until one person submitted or was visibly stunned by a blow. One fight stopped immediately when a man bloodied his opponent's nose. Bichette rolled her eyes at this, though I couldn't tell if she thought less of the woman for allowing herself to be struck, or the man for being reckless enough to hurt her. Show that you're a brave man by challenging women to fights. Yep. There were several bouts with wooden swords, too. These tended to go more quickly, as even a light touch was considered enough for a victory. Who won that one? I asked, after a quick exchange of clacking swordplay ended with both women scoring hits at the same time. Neither, she said, frowning. Why don't they fight again if it was a tie? I asked. Bichette frowned at me. It wasn't a tie, strictly speaking. Dren would have died in minutes, struck through the lung. Lasriel would have died in days when the wound in her gut soured. So Lasriel won? Bichette gave me a look of withering contempt and turned her attention back to the next fight. The tall Adem man who had asked Bichette to fight was bouting with a thin whip of a woman. Strangely, he used a wooden sword while she was barehanded. He won by a narrow margin after catching 2 solid kicks to the ribs. Who won there? Bichette asked me. I could tell she wasn't looking for the obvious answer. It's not much of a victory, I said. She didn't even have a sword. She is of the 3rd stone and far outstrips him as a fighter. It was the only way for things to be balanced between them, unless he were to bring a companion to fight by his side, Bichette pointed out. So I ask again, who won? He won the bout, I said, but he'll have some impressive bruises tomorrow. Also, his swings seemed somewhat reckless. Bichette turned to look at me. So who won? I thought about it for a moment. Neither, I decided. She nodded, formal approval. The gesture warmed me, as everyone facing us could see it. At long last, Shane stepped into the circle. She had removed her lopsided yellow hat, and her graying hair swirled about in the wind. Seeing her among the other Adem, I realized how small she was. She carried herself with such confidence that I had come to think of her as taller, but she barely came up to the shoulder of some of the taller Adem. She carried a straight wooden sword with her. Nothing ornate, but it was carved to have the same shape of a hilt and blade. Many of the other practice swords I had seen were barely more than smooth sticks that gave the impression of being swords. Her white shirt and pants were tied tightly to her body with thin white cords. Alongside Shane came a much younger woman. She was shorter than Shane by an inch or so. Her frame was more delicate, too, her small face and shoulders making her look almost childlike. But the pronounced curve of her high breasts and round hips beneath her tight mercenary reds made it obvious she was no child. Her wooden sword was also carved. It was curved slightly, unlike most of the others I had seen. Her sandy hair was braided into a long, narrow plait that hung down to the small of her back. The two of them raised their swords and began to circle each other. The young woman was amazing. She struck so fast I could barely see the motion of her hand, let alone the blade of her sword. But Shane brushed it away casually with drifting snow, taking half a step in retreat. Then, before Shane could respond with an attack of her own, the young woman spun away, her long braid swinging. "Who is she?" I asked. "Penth," Bichette said admiringly. "She is a fury, is she not? Like one of our old ancestors." Penth closed with Shane again, feinting and thrusting. She darted in, low to the ground, impossibly low. Her back leg thrust out for balance, not even touching the ground. Her sword arm licked out in front of her, her knee bent so deeply that her entire body was below the level of my head, even though I was sitting cross-legged on the ground. Penth unfurled all this sinuous motion as quickly as you can snap your fingers. The tip of her sword came in low under Shane's guard and angled up toward her knee. "What is that?" I asked softly, not even expecting an answer. "You never showed me that." But it was just astonished noise. Never in 100 years could my body do that. But Shane somehow avoided the attack, not leaping away with any sudden motion, not darting out of reach. She was quick, but that was not the heart of how she moved. Instead, she was deliberate and perfect. She was already halfway gone before Penth's sword had begun to flick her toward her leg. The tip of Penth's sword must have come within an inch of her knee, but it was not a close thing. Shane had only moved as much as was needed, no more. This time, Shane did manage to counterattack, stepping forward with Sparrow Strikes the hawk. Penth rolled sideways, touched the grass briefly, then pushed herself up off the ground. No, she threw herself away from the ground, using only her left hand. Her body snapped like a steel spring, arcing away while her sword licked out twice, driving Shane back. Penth was full of passion and fury. Shane was calm and steady. Penth was a storm, Shane a stone. Penth was a tiger and Shane a bird. Penth danced and wove madly. Shane turned and took one single perfect step. Penth slashed and spun and whirled and struck and struck and struck. And then they stopped. the tip of Penn's wooden sword pressed to Shane's white shirt. I gasped, though not loudly enough to draw any attention. Only then did I realize my heart was racing. My entire body was covered in sweat. Shane lowered her sword, gesturing irritation, admiration, and a mingling of other things I couldn't identify. She bared her teeth a little in a grimace and used her hand to chafe roughly at her ribs where Pent had struck her, the same way you rub your shin when you bark it against a chair. Horrified, I turned to Vachette. "Will she be the new leader of the school?" I asked. Vachette looked at me, puzzled. I gestured to the open circle in front of us where the two women stood talking. "This is Pent. She's beaten Shane." Vachette looked at me for a moment, uncomprehending, then burst out in a long, delighted laugh. "Shane is old," she said. "She is a grandmother. You cannot expect her to always win against a limber young thing like Pent, all full of fire and fresh wind." "Ah," I said, "I see. I thought—" Vachette was kind enough not to laugh at me again. "Shane is not the head of the school because no one can beat her. What an odd notion. What chaos that would be, everything tipping this way and that, changing with the luck of one fight or another." She shook her head. "Shane is the head because she is a marvelous teacher, and because her understanding of the Lithani is deep. She is the head because she is wise in the ways of the world, and because she is clever at dealing with troublesome problems." She tapped me pointedly on the chest with 2 fingers. Then Vachette made a conciliatory gesture. "She is also an excellent fighter, of course. We would not have a leader who could not fight. Shane's Catan is without equal. But a leader is not a muscle. A leader is a mind." I looked up in time to see Shane approaching. One of the cords holding her sleeve in place had come loose during the fight, and the cloth was fluttering in the wind like a luffing snail. Sail! She had donned her lopsided yellow cap again and gestured formal greeting to both of us. Then Shane turned to me. At the end, she asked, "Why was I struck?" Curiosity. Frantically, I thought back to the final moments of the fight, looking them over in my mind's eye. I tried to gesture with the subtlety Vachette had been teaching me. Respectful uncertainty. "You misplaced your heel slightly," I said. "Your left heel." Shane nodded. "Good." She gestured pleased approval, widely enough so anyone who happened to be watching could see it. And, of course, everyone was. Giddy with praise, but conscious of the fact that I was being watched, I kept my face locked in the proper impassivity as Shane walked away with Pent in tow. I leaned my head close to Vachette's. "I like Shane's little hat," I said. Vachette shook her head and sighed. "Come." She jostled my shoulder with her own and got to her feet. "We should leave before you spoil the good impression you have made today." That night at supper, I sat in my customary place at the corner of one table by the wall farthest from the food. Since no one was willing to sit within 10 feet of me, there was no sense my taking up space where people might actually want to sit. "Hi." My good mood still buoyed me, so I was not surprised when I saw a flicker of red slide into the seat across from me. Carceret again. Once or twice a day she made a point to come close enough to hiss a few words at me. She was overdue. But looking up, I was surprised. Vachette sat across from me. She nodded, her impassive face staring into my astonished one. Then I composed myself, nodded back, and we ate for a while in companionable silence. After we were finished eating, we passed some time pleasantly, speaking softly of small things. We left the dining hall together, and when we stepped into the evening air, I switched back into Waturan so I could properly articulate something I'd been thinking of for several hours. "Vachette," I said, "it occurs to me it would be nice to fight someone whose ability is somewhat closer to my own." Vachette laughed, shaking her head. "That is like throwing 2 virgins into a bed. Enthusiasm, passion, and ignorance are not a good combination. Someone is likely to get hurt." "I hardly think it's fair to call my fighting virginal," I said. "I'm not near your level, but you yourself said my Catan is remarkably good." "I said your Catan was remarkably good considering the amount of time you have been studying," she corrected me, "which is less than 2 months, which is no time at all." "It's frustrating," I admitted. "If I strike a blow against you, it's because you let me. There is no substance to it. You've given it to me. I haven't earned it for myself." "Any strike or throw you make against me is earned," she said, "even if I offer it to you. But I understand. There is something to be said for honest competition." I started to say something else, but she put her hand over my mouth. "I've said I understand. Stop fighting after you have won." Hand still over my mouth, she tapped a finger thoughtfully. "Very well. Continue your progress, and I will find you someone at your own level to fight." Hi, baby. I'll do one more. Chapter 116. Height. I was almost beginning to feel comfortable in Hert. My language was improving, and I felt less isolated now that I was able to exchange brief pleasantries with others. Bichette occasionally shared meals with me, helping me feel like slightly less of a pariah. We had done sword work this morning, which meant an easy start to the day. Bichette was still showing me how the sword was incorporated into the katana, and the moments we fought were few and far between. After a few hours of this, we worked on my edemic, then more sword work. After lunch, we moved on to hand fighting. I couldn't help but feel that here, at least, I was progressing well. After half an hour, not only was Bichette breathing harder, but she began to sweat a bit. I was still no sort of challenge to her, of course, but after days of humiliating nonchalance on her part, she was finally having to put forth a shred of effort to keep ahead of me. So we continued to fight, and I noticed that, how can I say this delicately, she smelled wonderful. Not like perfume or flowers or anything like that. She smelled like clean sweat and oiled metal and crushed grass from when I'd thrown her to the ground some time before. It was a good smell. I can't describe this delicately, I suppose. What I mean to say is that she smelled like sex. Not as if she'd been having it, as if she was made of it. When she came in close to grapple me, the smell of her combined with her body pressing against mine. For a second it was like someone had thrown a switch in my head. All I could think of was kissing her mouth, biting the soft skin of her neck, tearing at her clothes, and licking the sweat off of her. I did none of these things, of course, but at the moment I wanted nothing more. This is embarrassing to look back on, but I will not bother defending myself except to point out that I was in the full flower of my youth, fit and healthy, and she was quite an attractive woman, though 10 years my senior. Add to this the simple fact that I had gone from the loving arms of Felurian to the eager arms of Losine, and from thence to a long barren stretch of training with Tempi as we traveled to Hert. That meant, for 3 span, I had been constantly exhausted, anxious, confused, and terrified by turns. Now I was none of these things. Bichette was a good teacher, and I made sure I was well rested and relaxed as possible. I was growing more confident in my abilities and more comfortable around her. Given all of this, it's no great surprise I had the reaction I did. At the time, however, I was startled and embarrassed as only a young man can be. I stepped away from Bichette, blushing and fumbling an apology. I tried to hide my obvious arousal, and in doing so only drew more attention to it. Bichette looked down at what my hands were trying vainly to conceal. Well, then, I suppose I will take that as a compliment and not a curious new avenue of attack. If a person could die from shame, I would have. Would you like to take care of it yourself? Bichette asked easily. Or do you prefer a partner? I beg your pardon, I said stupidly. Come now, she gestured to my hands. Even if you could keep your mind away from that, it would doubtless throw your balance off. She gave a low, throaty chuckle. You'll need to tend to it before we continue your lessons. I can leave you to it, or we can find a soft spot and see who can pin the other best 2 of 3. The casual tone of her voice convinced me I'd misunderstood her. Then she gave me a knowing smirk, and I realized I'd understood her perfectly well. Where I come from, a teacher and a student would never... I stumbled, trying to think of a polite way to diffuse the situation. Bichette rolled her eyes at me, the exasperated expression looking odd on Adem's face. Do your teachers and students also never fight, never talk, never eat together? But this, I said, this? She sighed. Kvothe, you need to remember, you come from a barbarous place. A barbarous? Barbarous place, I don't know. Much of what you grew up thinking is quite wrong-headed and foolish. None of it as much as the strange customs you barbarians have built around your sex play. Bichette, I said, She cut me off with a sharp gesture. Whatever you were about to say, I have doubtless heard before from my poet king. But there are only so many hours of light in the day, so I ask you this, are you desirous of sex? I gave a helpless shrug, knowing it would be pointless to deny it. Would you like to have sex with me? I could still smell her. At that moment, I wanted it more than anything. Yes. Are you free of disease? She asked seriously. I nodded, too off balance to be startled by the frankness of the question. Very well, then. If I remember correctly, there is a nice patch of moss out of the wind not too far from here. She began to walk up a nearby hill, her fingers working the buckle that fastened her sword's scabbard over her shoulder. Come with me. As long as they don't sing. Yeah, exactly. That's what I was thinking, too. Singing is like, no. But this is like, nah, come on. Don't be such a prude. Her memory did serve her well. 2 trees arched their branches over a thick bed of soft moss that was snugged up against a small stony bluff, sheltered from the wind by some convenient bushes. What was that about? Bagheera, where you going? Yeah, seriously. It quickly became obvious that what Bichette had in mind was not an afternoon of twining idly in the shade. To say she was businesslike would be a great disservice to her, as Bichette's laughter always ran very close to the surface, but she was not flirtatious or coy. She stripped off her mercenary reds without the least fanfare or teasing, revealing a few scars and a body hard and lean and corded with muscle, which isn't to say that she wasn't also round and soft as well. Then she teased me for staring as if I'd never seen a naked woman before, when the truth was I'd simply never seen one standing full naked in the sunlight. When I didn't undress fast enough to suit her, Bichette laughed and mocked my bashfulness. Stepping close, she stripped me naked as a plucked chicken, then kissed me on the mouth, her warm skin pressing against the entire front of my body. "I've never kissed a woman my own height before," I mused when we stopped for breath. "It's a different experience." "See how I continue to be your teacher in all things," she said. "Your next lesson is this. All women are the same height lying down. The same cannot be said for your sort, of course. Too much depends on a man's mood and his natural gifts." Bichette took my hand and brought us both to lie on the soft moss. "There," she said, "as I suspected. Now you are taller than me. Does this set you at your ease?" It did. I was prepared for things to be awkward after Bichette and I returned from the bushes, and was surprised to find they were nothing of the sort. She did not suddenly grow flirtatious, which I wouldn't have known how to cope with. Neither did she feel obliged to treat me with any newfound tenderness. This became clear somewhere around the 5th time she managed to lure me off my guard, catch me with thunder upward, and throw me roughly to the ground. In all, she acted as if nothing odd at all had happened, which meant either nothing odd had happened, or something very odd had happened and she was pointedly ignoring it, which meant that everything was lovely, or everything was going terribly wrong. Later, as I ate supper alone, I rolled what I knew of the Edem round in my head. No nudity taboo. They didn't consider physical contact particularly intimate. Bichette had been very casual both before, during, and after our encounter. I thought back to the naked couple I had stumbled onto several days ago. They had been startled, but not embarrassed. Sex was viewed differently here, obviously, but I didn't know any of the specific differences. That meant I didn't have the first idea of how to conduct myself properly. And that meant that what I was doing was as dangerous as walking around blind. More like running blind, really. Normally, if I had a question about the Edem culture, I asked Bichette. She was my touchstone. But I could imagine too many ways for that conversation to go astray, and her goodwill was all that stood between me and the loss of my fingers. By the time I finished eating, I decided it would be best to simply follow Bichette's lead. She was my teacher, after all. Well, alright. Those first 2 chapters were pretty long, and then this one was pretty short, but then there's the next one looks like it's kind of a longer one as well. So I'll stop here, and we will plan tentatively for Saturday. I know I have some plans, but I don't know anything about, like, timing yet, when those will be over with. But let's play Saturday by ear. Okay. Thanks for watching. See you next time.